From diarrhea to neurological dysfunction, organisms in the Clostridium and Clostridioides genera cause a wide variety of infections in people and animals. These infections are oftentimes associated with the production of very interesting and well-studied toxins. In today's lecture, we're talking about two really important genera that are associated with diseases across the mammalian and avian worlds. For the most part, these organisms are considered biocontainment level 2, although Clostridium botulinum needs to be handled under containment level 3 conditions when the laboratory work has the potential to generate aerosols. These are gram-positive, spore-forming rods. Important to know that not all species stain well, so some can look artifactually gram-negative, even though their cell wall has a gram-positive composition. These are anaerobic bacteria, which are variably tolerant of oxygen. So some are incredibly strict anaerobes, like Clostridium hemolyticum and novii, and can be very challenging to grow, while others, like Clostridioides difficile and Clostridium perfringens, are quite a bit less fussy. And as I mentioned, these organisms are famous for toxin production. We can link back much of the pathology we see to particular virulence factors produced by these bacteria. Here you can see a gram stain of Clostridium perfringens, really nice gram-positive rods. These are very regular cells. You can see just how uniform they are in thickness. And they're, in fact, so uniform that they're described as having a boxcar morphology. Classically, like you can see down here, we have cells of essentially exactly the same size. I know there is a little bit of diversity here, but typically speaking, our Clostridium perfringens are incredibly homogeneous. This is a pure culture of Clostridium perfringens on blood agar, and I think you can appreciate that it's hemolytic. And if you look carefully, you may be able to see a double zone of hemolysis. So just under the colony, there's this very bright zone of clearing where the erythrocytes are completely lysed. And then spreading out some distance from the colony, there's a secondary zone of fainter beta hemolysis. These two zones of hemolysis can be really useful diagnostically. And in fact, we can enhance that second zone by placing a pure culture in the fridge for a short period of time. It's activated by cold. In these two images, you can see pure cultures of Clostridium tetani. On the left, we have a gram stain. And what I wanted to highlight here is the classical drumstick morphology. Clostridium tetani, when it sporulates, it produces terminal spores. So we get endospores, like you can see here and here, which develop at the end of the organism, giving it this classical drumstick morphology. On the right, we have an example of a special staining technique, which was done to allow the visualization of flagella. And I think you can appreciate these long, squiggly structures emanating out from the bacteria, which are really important for motility. They allow the organism to move in its environment. Overall, the Clostridia have a wide distribution. They're found in the environment, they're in water, they're in soil, and many species are also part of the normal microbiota, so we find them in feces. On the right, you can see Clostridium spiriforme. This is a normal inhabitant of the rabbit gut, and it normally doesn't cause any problems at all. When these animals are exposed to certain types of antibiotics orally, we get the stimulation of toxin production and a rapidly fatal cascade of pathological events. So this organism is in fact the reason that we don't use penicillins or macrolides orally in our lygomorph species. In the genus Clostridium, we have 160 species. Clostridioides, which is a relatively newly defined genera, only includes 2 species, most importantly, Clostridioides difficile. So this used to be known as Clostridium difficile. We can differentiate these bacteria both morphologically and using a number of biochemical tests. Microscopically, the presence of terminal spores is going to be highly characteristic for Clostridium tetani. If we have spores in other parts, we can then subject the organisms to the lecithinase and lipase tests, and you can see the different reactions for each group of bacteria here. Clostridium perfringens is unique in its ability to produce what's called the stormy clot reaction in litmus milk. So on the left here, we have the litmus milk test. This tube on the left is an uninoculated. So this is the base color of the liquid when we have it prepared. And on the right, we have the stormy clot. So we get coagulation of the milk and it takes on this stormy appearance. We can presumptively identify the presence of Clostridioides difficile based on its smell. So pure cultures classically have this horse urine smell, and also its ability to fluoresce under UV light. So the colonies will glow sort of a chartreuse green, which differentiates it from other anaerobic organisms. There are a lot of well-defined virulence factors in our Clostridium and Clostridioides. So when you think of these genera, I want you to think toxins. Very, very important. Generally, they're quite well described, and we're going to discuss each key toxin with each pathogen as we go through today's lecture. Because there are so many different species of Clostridium and Clostridioides, I think it's helpful to think about them and group them in terms of the types of disease that they're associated with. So we have our neurotoxic species, Clostridium tetani and Clostridium botulinum, which cause tetanus and botulism respectively. Our histotoxic species, so those which affect solid tissues, Clostridium chauvii, the cause of blackleg in cattle and other ruminants, Clostridium septicum, which causes malignant edema, Clostridium novii, which causes necrotic hepatitis, and then certain strains of Clostridium perfringens, which can cause gangrene in many animal species, including humans. And then, of course, we have our enterotoxic species, so Clostridium, which cause diarrhea. Clostridium perfringens is well recognized as a cause of bloody diarrhea in lambs, pigs, chickens, and also people. Certain toxinotypes cause pulpy kidney disease in sheep. And in dogs and horses, we have acute hemorrhagic diarrhea syndromes associated with certain strains. Clostridium piliforme causes Tyser's disease in horses. Spiriforme causes this antibiotic-induced typhlocollitis in rabbits that I mentioned earlier. And then finally, Clostridioides difficile, in a veterinary context, is most important in pigs, where it causes scours and mesocolonic edema, and in people, where it causes historically antibiotic-associated diarrhea, but increasingly we see it as a cause of disease in the community in people who may not have pre-existing risk factors. We're going to begin today's discussion with Clostridium tetani, so the agent of tetanus. This is a bacteria that we find in soil. It's really ubiquitous, and it's really ubiquitous, particularly in soils contaminated with feces. Organisms get into the body through breaches in the skin. So this is sort of the classical stepping on a rusty nail scenario. In veterinary species, we can also see it when we have fecal contamination of the umbilicus, or potentially also during tail docking. Essentially, the pathogenesis is that the organism multiplies in necrotic tissue. And so if you can find the focus of infection, you can certainly culture it. Once we have the organism growing, it produces a variety of toxins which cause the systemic effects. In this image here, you can see a cut section of a horse foot where there was a deep penetrating wound right here. And what I hope you can appreciate is that it takes a relatively small focus of infection in order to get a systemic intoxication and life-threatening disease. So the disease caused by Clostridium tetani is due to this toxin production. And we have two key toxins that are involved: tetanolysin, which enhances tissue invasion and allows the actual multiplication of the organisms to progress, and tetanospasmin, which is a neurotoxin that's responsible for the extreme muscle stiffness of both the flexor and extensor muscles. We treat these infections using high-dose penicillin, and tetanus antitoxin. It can be very, very, very expensive, so this may not be an option for our large animal species. And what we see clinically is spasmodic paralysis. In this painting here, you can see a patient, a depiction of a person with tetanus displaying this characteristic opisthotonous pose. So extreme muscle stiffness. This muscle stiffness can be so extreme that it actually breaks bones. I've put a link to a clip above from Gray's Anatomy where you can see a dramatization of what this might look like. One of the colloquial names of the disease tetanus is called lockjaw. So we also see spasm of muscles of the face, and that results in this characteristic sardonic smile or rhesus sardonicus, where the patient, including our veterinary species, sort of appears to be smiling. And you can see how the muscles on the face of this dog are affected. He almost has this sort of snarling appearance, and his eyes are very widely open. If we look at the whole body of animals that are affected, here we have images of a calf and a sheep displaying extensor rigidity. You can see both of these animals look very stiff, and this sheep is actually showing what is apparently the classical position expected for our animal species with tetanus, rigidly extending out their legs and neck. Moving on to Clostridium botulinum, the cause of botulism, this organism is also widely disseminated. We find it in soils and aquatic environments, and we get the production of toxins when spores germinate in anaerobic environments. These spores are extremely resistant. They can actually survive boiling. And so when we're preparing home canned foods, it's important to use a pressure canner, which is essentially an autoclave that's able to destroy those spores. Boiling food products prior to canning may not be sufficient. The disease results from this extremely potent toxin, botulinum toxin. 1 milligram is estimated to be able to kill 120 million mice. And the way that this toxin works is by preventing the release of acetylcholine at the neuromuscular junction. And so you prevent signal transduction and you get flaccid paralysis of muscles. So it's kind of the opposite of tetanus. Tetanus, spasmodic paralysis; botulism, flaccid paralysis. We have different types of botulinum toxin that are recognized and very creatively named A through G. Each of these toxins has a host predilection where it's most likely to cause disease. In people, we see disease associated with types A, B, E, F, and rarely G. In horses, so Shaker foals, this is primarily associated with type B. Type C in waterfowl, so these are like ducks. And then birds which eat fish can become affected with botulinum toxin type E. The reason for this is that if we have intoxicated fish, so they have some flaccid paralysis themselves, they're actually easier to catch, and then that toxin makes its way up the food chain into the birds that are eating them. On the right here, you can see an image of an ox with botulism, and in our ruminant species, a drooping tongue is a classical sign of flaccid paralysis. The source of Clostridium botulinum or botulism toxin is varied, and understanding where it's coming from in each situation is really critical to understanding the pathogenesis and ultimately controlling and eliminating access to that toxin and preventing further propagation of disease. In our ruminant species, it's actually been associated with poultry litter, so contaminated poultry litter that's either used as feed or fertilizer on pasture. In cattle and horses, we can see forges as a source. So within large round bales, we can get anaerobic conditions at the center, allowing the growth of the organism. And it's thought that the initial contamination of those round bales results from inadvertently scooping up nesting birds or potentially rodents when the hay is being baled in the field. There's also the possibility of carrion-contaminated plant material. So an animal dies in proximity to the feed and contaminates it with the toxin. In fish, we see feed containing Clostridium botulinum type E, which germinate in the feed, are then consumed. In people, it's primarily food associated, improperly preserved canned foods, meats, and vegetables. In waterfowl, we can see some really interesting scenarios where we get mass die-offs of birds. The source of the organism or the toxin is thought to be invertebrates or detritus on the lake bottom. So we have Clostridium botulinum spores on the lake bottom. Birds are diving down and eating either plant material or invertebrates from the lake bottom. They become intoxicated and get droopy necks, which you can see here, an intoxicated bird. And while they're floating on the lake, if they have droopy necks, they can actually drown. Or if there's enough toxin, they can go into respiratory failure. Those birds then wash up on the shore where they're consumed by maggots. The tissue consumed by the maggots can contain a high enough concentration of botulinum toxin that when the maggots themselves are consumed, we can see secondary intoxications of the animals eating the maggots. So you have dead birds on the beach covered in maggots. Other birds come along and think that they have an easy snack waiting for them, all these delicious invertebrates. They eat the maggots, become intoxicated, and then die themselves. I've put a link to a video above where an outbreak of Clostridium botulinum in Tunisia is described. In people, there are 5 forms of botulism which are recognized. So foodborne, we've already discussed, most commonly associated with home canned foods. Wound botulism is certainly possible, and this is where you have an actual infection with Clostridium botulinum. You have actively replicating bacteria that are then also producing toxin. And this is most common in IV drug users. Infant botulism is a scenario that's similar to Shaker foals, where we have replication of the organism in the intestines and the release of toxin from the gut. This is actually an important reason to not feed babies honey. We can see adult intestinal toxemia, which is very similar to the infant gut. And then we have iatrogenic botulism, which you can sort of think of as an oops scenario. Botulinum toxin is used therapeutically and for cosmetic purposes. And if it's accidentally injected into the vasculature or too much toxin is used, we can see pathology associated with that. Treatment of Clostridium botulinum really depends on the pathogenesis of the disease. So in cases where an animal actually has an infection, antibiotics are useful. If you actually have replicating organisms in the gut, antimicrobials are going to be an important part of a therapeutic strategy. But if you have animals which are simply intoxicated, antibiotics are not warranted and will not be beneficial. Antitoxin is very, very important. So to try and neutralize circulating toxin, and then supportive therapy. In the case of companion animals, things like stool softeners and soft bedding to prevent decubital sores or bed ulcers. Remember, these animals have flaccid paralysis, so they can't move around. And in severely affected animals, mechanical ventilation may also be required. And you'll find Clostridium botulinum toxoid included in multivalent Clostridium vaccines.